this is Izzy at Minerva. In today's tutorial we're going to take a look at how to create an elasticated waistband. Now we're going to be using our skirt block to do this, but you can apply this principle to your trouser block as well. So this is going to be a great fun little exercise. Let's get into it. As usual with the pattern drafting series, you're going to need your standard pattern drafting kit, which is listed next to me here. In order to do this pattern drafting series, you're going to need your skirt block or your trouser block. So grab that and pop that on the table and then pop a piece of tracing paper over it so that you can start drafting out your basic block shape for your skirt and your corresponding waistband. The first thing we're going to do is to just do a casing for the elastic to sit into for the skirt back. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply just going to actually extend this line up, keep it really simple, make sure it's parallel with my hip line and draw another point up here. I'm then going to do the same for the centre back. I'm just going to extend that line up to here and then I'm just going to square that off. Now, the next thing that we want to know is what is the depth of our casing that we want our elastic to go into. Now, the elastic that we've got here is 3 centimetres wide, and that's the width of the elastic that I'm going to be using for my elasticated skirt. So if I lay that over on top of my new sort of casing piece, I know that if I draw the casing at exactly 3 centimetres, it's going to be a really tight fit. So what I'm going to do is just to add a little bit of extra, probably just 5mm extra, to make the casing just a little bit wider than my elastic. So if my elastic is 3 centimetres wide, I want my casing piece to be at least 3.5 wide. And let's just mark on that that is the back casing. Now let's just repeat that whole process for the skirt front. Start off by drawing a line that extends beyond the centre front line. And likewise, the side seam, just extend that up as well. And then just square that off. And once again, just check that the length of your line here is the same as the width of your hip, the length of that line here at this point, which for me will be 25.2. Then just draw in the width of 3.5 or whatever you need for your elastic casing. Make sure you just label that front casing. Okay, so now we've done the casing, what we need to make sure is that the top of the rest of the garment, the trousers or the skirt, is now going to attach onto that casing without any problems. So let's go back to our blocks and let's just take a quick look at this. Our casing of our back is the same width as our hip proportion. So in order to just make sure that our skirt is going to fit on, we need to make sure that the top of this bit, top of the waist, is the same length as the casing. So to start off with, we're just going to draw a straight line from our centre back, and we're just going to take that line all the way along to extend just beyond our side seam. I'm then simply just going to extend my side seam all the way up to that point. And what that does is it just basically squares off the skirt. It gives it a really nice simple shape, and the width of this is the same as the width of that, so they're going to tie together really nicely when we sew them together. Let's repeat that process for the skirt front. So once again, we're just going to draw a line from the centre front, straight across, and extend the side seam up to that line. Now, because the fit of the garment is quite forgiving, we're not going to do any more alterations to the top of the garment at this point. The only other thing we need to do now is just to draft out how long our piece of elastic needs to be. Now the elastic is going to fit around our waist circumference, so the first thing we need to do is to work out and calculate what our waist circumference is. So as we've done previously, we're just going to measure the curve of the waistband up to here on the front. We're going to miss out the dart and then continue measuring from this point out that way. So just grab a tape measure rather than a ruler, because this is a curved line, and just walk that out so that you know exactly how long it is. Make a note of that. Do the same on the skirt back, working from the side seam across to this dart, leaving out the volume of the dart and continuing along this stretch here. Again, leaving out the volume of the dart and then continuing all the way to the centre back. Make a note of that. Now, in order to work out our full waist circumference, we need to take those two measurements we've just done and times them by 2. Now, those measurements that we've made are obviously only for half of the skirt back and half of the skirt front. So tap in your measurements for your skirt waist front and then add your skirt waist back and then times that number by 2 to calculate the overall circumference of your waist. Make a little note of that as we've done up here. Now, as a rule of thumb, when we're working out the length of elastic required, you take the length of the area around the body that you're trying to fit to and multiply that length by 0.8. So we're actually reducing the length of the elastic compared to the actual circumference of the area we're trying to cover it by. And what this does is it just ensures the elastic is just going to clinch in, it's just going to like sit in really nicely and stay there and hold it there. If you did the elastic to be the same circumference as your waist, it wouldn't have that sort of fitted feel about it. And the good thing about elastic is the fact that it does stretch quite easily. So we're going to use a calculation that multiplies our full waist circumference by 0.8 in order to work out what we think our elastic measurement needs to be. Now, this is a rule of thumb and everybody has a different body shape and everyone likes their clothes to fit differently. So why don't you start off with this and then make a little note of how much you multiplied your waist circumference by in order to get your elastic length. And in the future, you may choose to alter that. You may want to have a more generous amount of elastic, or you may want and prefer your clothes to be a bit tighter. The other thing to consider is that every little piece of elastic has a different type of elasticity in it. So what I'm using will be different to what you're using. So the maths here is just going to be a broad estimate for us all, and then you need to tweak that once you actually fit your garment yourself. Okay, so take your circumference of your waist and times that by 0.8. Make a little note of that there. And next, we're just going to draw a line that is as long as you've calculated you need. So for me, that's 59.3. For you, it may well be something different. The next thing you want to do is just to draw out the width of your elastic. So for me, that is 3 centimeters. For you, it may well be something a little bit different. And then just square that off at the top at the appropriate length. Just label that up to say elastic length guide so you don't forget what all these different bits are. At this point now, we're just going to pop some tracing paper over our pattern pieces we've drafted and we're going to add our seam allowances. Okay, let's start off by looking at our front casing piece, which is just underneath our tracing paper at this point here. So our front casing is going to sit on top of the front of our skirt. So the width of it needs to be the same width as our elastic here, and a little bit wider. So that is how it is. However, the fabric that we cut to go around the elastic obviously needs to come over one side and tuck in down the other side. So it's going to come here, wrap around, and then it needs to have a bottom seam allowance to attach onto the skirt. So the first thing I'm going to do is to draw out the other half, the corresponding half of this casing piece. And that is going to be effectively double the width of our casing. So if my casing was 3.5, I effectively want to draw a casing now that is 7 centimeters wide in order to ensure that my pattern piece creates a nice casing. I'm then going to add my 1.5 centimeter seam allowance to that line. I'm going to add my 1.5 centimeter seam allowance to the bottom of my casing piece as well. And I'm going to then add a seam allowance to one side. The other side, I'm just going to draw a line straight down. And for this one, we're then going to annotate it to say place on fold. We want our grain line to correspond with our hemline effectively. and we need to label this front casing. We're going to repeat that process for the back casing. So I know that I want my width to be double the width of the back casing plus my 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. So I'm just going to draw that in straight off. And if you've drawn them side by side as I have, you can literally almost just extend that line right across, can't you? Add your 1.5 centimetre seam allowance to the bottom, and then add your seam allowance just to one side only. Annotate your pattern piece, place on fold, grain line, and elastic waistband casing back. Cut one on fold. Now with our elastic length guide, we need to make sure that we can tie it all together and that it's got a seam allowance to overlap so we can sew the ends together so the elastic is in one big loop. So our elastic guide is going to be the length that it already is plus 3 centimetres. Now the reason we've got 3 centimetres is because we want to allow for 1.5 centimetres on one side and 1.5 centimetres on the other side. So this is one long length. We're not cutting this piece on the fold. We're just going to cut one length of elastic, so we need to add 3 centimetres on to the end of the pattern piece. Okay, so that deals with all the casing and the elastic, which will be the same for everybody. At this point, it's up to you how you want to draft your skirt. It may be that you want to draft a really gathered skirt to fit onto your casing, and you can look back at previous tutorials about how to create a gathered skirt. However, for this tutorial, I'm just going to use our standard skirt block and just trace around what we've already done here. So this will be different for everybody, so I'll just quickly whiz this past you all so you understand what we're doing. Whatever you've decided to do, you need to add your seam allowance to the side of your bottom bit of your garment. You'll need to add a seam allowance to the top of your garment as well, because this is going to attach onto the casing. So add your 1.5 centimetre seam allowance up at that point, and then obviously your centre back will remain as it is because we'll be placing it on the fold. Add your hip notches, place on fold, grain line. This is just my skirt back, so cut one on fold. And then you repeat the whole process for the skirt front. Add your seam allowance to the top of the waistband and your seam allowance to the side seam. Don't forget that if you're adding a hem to your garment, you need to add the appropriate seam allowance to your hem and add your hip notch. Don't forget to add your place on fold annotation down your centre front, your grain line. Brilliant, I hope that all makes loads of sense and is really clear. Obviously your garment will be something that's different to mine, so your bottom of your skirt may look something completely different. Let's cut those pattern pieces out and then cut them out of fabric, and off we go. Now I've just annotated on my pattern pieces which is the back and which is the front, because they're very similar in size, aren't they? So we're going to assume that this is the right side of my back facing up, and I'm going to put the right side of my front skirt facing down over it. And as you can see, we've got our nice hip notches at this point here, so we're just going to line those up and line up the waist and the hem, and then just pin it all the way down. We always like to pin perpendicular to the seam allowance, as I've done here, just because it allows you to then pull them out really quickly as you're sewing at the sewing machine. And also if you have it this way up, you can pull them out, you can see the pins because they're hanging over the raw edge, or if you're putting the fabric through the machine this way up, you can easily see them. So it works both ways really nicely. Once you've pinned one side, you can then repeat the process for the other side. Don't forget that as we sew this today, we're just using this as a technical demonstration of how to insert an elasticated waistband into your skirt. Therefore, we're not going to be showing you how to do finishes and finishing seams and things like that, but that's totally up to you. That's your own design choice as you progress through the course and choose and style your own garments. As always with this course, we're going to use contrasting thread on our sewing machine, just so that you can see it clearly at home on the video. At this point, you can either finish those seams using your preferred method, whether that's overlocking or cutting with pinking shears, or just doing a little delicate zigzag stitch all the way along. But whichever finish you choose to do, I would thoroughly recommend that you press the seam open and just secure those stitches first. Great, at this point we've got our back casing and our front casing, and we're just going to sew those together at the side seams. So with the right sides together, just lay one on top of the other, and then just pin down the side seams. Next, we'll sew those using a 1.5cm seam allowance. Again, once you've done that, I'd recommend that you just press those seam allowances open and then finish your side seams however you choose to. What we're wanting to do at this point is attach our skirt waistband to our skirt. Now this is a really simple process because they're both the same width for this particular pattern. You may well have created a really wide skirt which is then gathered, and the gathers need to fit into the waistband. That's fine, you do whatever you need to do. There are a number of different ways of attaching our waistband onto our skirt. You could simply just fold the waistband in half with wrong sides together and then sew that to the top of the skirt, insert the elastic and finish it off really nicely with an overlocker. Or you could try and hide the seam allowance into your waistband, and that's the way that we're going to show you today. So with right sides together, I want you just to pop the casing over the skirt. It doesn't matter which side is up because it's just one big rectangle. Grab your pins and then line up the side seams and pin those in place first. So we pin the front together, and we're now just going to go and pin the back together. Great, once you've done that, I want you to sew all the way around the top of that skirt using your 1.5cm seam allowance. Once you've done that, turn the skirt inside out and then press the seam allowance up towards the top of the waistband. Okay, great, so we've pushed that seam allowance up, which is fantastic. What I want us to do now is just to turn the top of the waistband seam allowance under with the wrong sides together, all the way around the top at 1.5cm seam allowance. Lots of different ways that you can do this. I'm just going to mark a point 3 centimetres from the top of the waistband, and that just acts as a really nice little marker for how much I need to turn the whole thing down by. So the raw edge will then be touching that 3 centimetre mark. I'm going to turn my raw edge down so it meets that 3 centimetre point. I'm just going to pop a little pin in place there. Great, once you've done that, I just want you to press that in place now that you know exactly where the 1.5cm seam allowance is. Once you've ironed that in place and you've tucked that down, we next want to just create that casing by rolling the waistband over just so it overlaps over this line slightly. Just pop a couple of pins in. You don't need loads of pins at this point because we're going to flip it over and pin it from the other side and limit it properly. It's just enough to hold it in place. Great. Now turn the skirt the right side facing out. Great. What I want you to do now is run a set of pins within that seam allowance just there so that you're catching the waistband on the inside. So you're going to sew a line of stitches securing your waistband bit to the skirt on the inside at that point. You want to make sure that the overlap on the inside isn't too much, otherwise your elastic won't actually fit into this casing that we're making. Brilliant. So hopefully you can see that we've pinned the waistband to the skirt, we've wrapped it over, and on the inside you can see that our pins, which are running right along and in that seam allowance, are holding the waistband together at this point. So when we stitch in the ditch, which is the next thing we're going to do, we're going to do a line of stitching right in that seam allowance there. When we stitch there, it's going to hold the rest of this waistband together. However, one thing that we mustn't forget is that we need to leave a gap at the back of the skirt to allow the elastic to thread into the casing. And at the back of the skirt, which for me is this side, and just towards the side, I'm going to add 2 pins as a little reminder to stop and start at this point. And the gap that I'm going to leave here is about 1.5 inches, 5 centimetres or so. Just enough to allow the width of my elastic to come in nice and easily. Right, so we're going to start here, we're going to sew all the way around and we're going to stop there. Just take this nice and slow because when you're stitching in the ditch, it is really important to get it as neat as possible. Otherwise the stitch line is going to show and it's going to look a bit messy. Perfect. We've now sewn all the way around that waistband by stitching in the ditch. The only thing that we've not sewn is we've not sewn it at this point here because we're going to thread our elastic through there in a minute. At this point, we're just going to thread our elastic through our casing. So grab a safety pin, the longer the better, and pop it at one end, and then at the other end, pop that through and then just attach it up to the casing. And then you just want to start threading the elastic through your new casing you've just created. Now this can take a few minutes, so just take your time, listen to a podcast, pop the radio on. As you're threading it through, try and keep the elastic nice and flat as much as you can so it doesn't twist around too much. Once you've got your elastic through and you're happy that it's all sitting nice and flat, then I want you to grab the 2 ends and overlap them about 1.5 centimetres. That's how much we drafted for the seam allowance. Now at this point we're going to sew the ends of the elastic together. I would recommend using a series of zigzag stitches, lightning bolt stitches or triple stitches on your sewing machine. Go backwards and forwards and just reinforce that seam really nicely and neatly together. Okay, so at this point your elastic looks something like this, all tied together in a nice long loop. Now time to stretch it back in to your casing, and at this point I would thoroughly recommend trying it on. Make sure you're happy with the size before we go any further. The next thing we're going to want to do is to pin this casing back over the waistband and the elastic and just pin it nice and carefully. Make sure the pins are holding the elastic to one side, that they're not pinning through the elastic. And then the final thing to do is just to stitch in the ditch from there across to here. Excellent. So excellent. The only last thing to do is just to distribute that elastic nice and evenly all the way around your skirt and then try it on. So here we have the finished elasticated waistband. This is such a common feature with so many patterns. It's a really excellent pattern drafting feature to have learnt. So it's really simple. You've all seen an elasticated waistband before, but it's really cool to learn how to actually draft it, isn't it? So thank you for joining me today. I hope you really enjoyed that. As ever, we've got lots more of these episodes to come, so please do subscribe to our Minerva YouTube account and keep following for lots more tutorials. As ever, we love to hear your comments and your feedback, so please do post your comments below the video and we will respond to you as soon as we can. And don't forget that you can create a Minerva account, which is free on our website, where you can upload photos and share with the maker community your creations. It's a really active and vibrant place to be, so please do create an account and join along. Thank you for joining me today. I will see you next time.